The storm had come without mercy. A curtain of rain sweeping across the wide and empty plains, drenching everything in its path. The sky, once pale with the fading light of day, had turned into a rolling mass of gray and black clouds that thundered, like a warning from heaven itself. Lightning split the horizon in crooked veins of fire, and in the middle of that unforgiving downpour walked a young woman, clutching her infant against her chest with the desperation of someone who had nothing left but the small life in her arms. Her hair clung to her face, plastered down by the rain, her dress torn and muddied at the hem. Every step a fight against exhaustion. The child whimpered, its small face pressed into her soaked shawl, shivering at the cold, and every sound pierced her heart like a blade. She whispered soft words, though her throat was raw from crying and pleading, and the rain drowned out most of her voice. Yet she spoke anyway because she knew if she stopped talking, she might collapse, and if she collapsed, the baby would have no one left. She had been cast out, not just asked to leave, not just pushed away, but driven from her home, from the settlement she had trusted, from the people she thought would protect her. Shame and anger burned in her chest, though they were dim embers compared to the roaring storm outside. The truth was simple and cruel. She had no place to go. She was marked, judged, and discarded. Now all she had was the endless prairie stretching out around her, mud sucking at her shoes, the rain soaking her through, and the fragile weight of the baby she refused to let slip from her grasp. For miles she walked, not knowing where her steps would take her, only that she had to keep moving. The darkness of the storm pressed in, making the land feel empty, hostile, endless. She wanted to scream, but her voice cracked. So she just wept silently, praying that someone somewhere would take pity on her and her child. Far off in the distance, cutting through the sheets of rain, the faint figure of a man on horseback emerged. He rode slow at first, shoulders hunched beneath the storm, hat pulled low against the downpour, leather coat darkened with water. He was a cowboy, his horse steady even in the mud, his eyes scanning the horizon like a man who had long ago learned to see through storms. Life had made him hard, and he carried himself like someone who had spent years alone, without company but his horse, the land, and the silence of his own thoughts. But on this night, through the fury of the storm, his gaze caught something unusual, the fragile silhouette of a woman stumbling, nearly collapsing into the mud, a bundle in her arms. At first he thought it a trick of the storm, a shadow cast by lightning. But when the cry of a baby carried faintly across the wind, he pulled on his reins and slowed his horse to a stop. For a moment he hesitated. His life was not one that welcomed others easily. He had carved out his solitude on purpose after loss had taken away more than he cared to remember. People brought trouble, and trouble was the last thing he wanted to invite back into his world. Yet as he watched the woman nearly fall, clutching her child tighter, something in him moved. A memory, faint but painful, stirred. The sight of another woman long ago, someone he had not been able to save. He set his jaw, breathed deep, and nudged his horse forward through the rain. The woman lifted her head weakly when she heard hooves cutting through the storm. Her eyes widened at the sight of the cowboy, fear flashing across her face. She held her baby tighter, as though even this stranger might take what little she had left. The cowboy reined in close, his horse stamping in the mud, and his deep voice cut through the rain. "Ma'am," he said simply, not loud but steady, like stone in the storm. She trembled, not answering, only backing up a step. He raised a gloved hand, not threatening, just calm. "You're gonna freeze out here. That little one's gonna freeze too." The words struck her because they were true. She wanted to scream, to demand why he cared, but the storm had robbed her of strength. Instead, tears welled in her eyes and mixed with the rain already streaming down her cheeks. She whispered, "They threw us out. I got nowhere to go." Her voice cracked as she clutched the baby tighter, shielding the child with her body. The cowboy's eyes softened, though his face stayed hard. He looked down at her, then at the bundle of life in her arms, and for the first time in years, something like compassion cracked the walls he had built around himself. He leaned down from his saddle, extending a strong, calloused hand. "I got a roof," he said, plain and simple. "It ain't much, but it's dry. Come on." She stared at him, torn between trust and fear. But when the baby gave a weak cry, she made her choice. With trembling steps, she took his hand. His grip was firm, steady, grounding, and before she could think, he had lifted her and her child up onto the saddle in front of him. She was too exhausted to protest, and as his arm wrapped protectively around her to steady them, she felt, for the first time in days, a sliver of safety. He clicked his tongue, and the horse carried them forward through the storm. The ride seemed endless, but the cowboy guided them with certainty, as though the storm could not shake him. After what felt like hours, the faint outline of a cabin appeared in the distance, small and weather-beaten but standing strong against the wind. When they finally reached it, he swung down from his horse and helped her down, steadying her on her feet. The cabin's lantern light glowed dimly through the rain-streaked windows, and for her, it felt like stepping out of despair into salvation. Inside, the warmth of a crackling fire soon filled the room. The cowboy set about quickly, moving with practiced ease. He took off his dripping coat, hung it by the fire, and fetched blankets from a trunk. She stood near the hearth, shivering, rocking her baby, still too stunned to speak. He handed her a blanket and nodded at the chair by the fire. "Sit, warm up the little one first." She obeyed, wrapping the blanket around her baby, pressing the child close to the flames until color slowly returned to its cheeks. Relief made her cry again, but this time the tears were softer, quieter, like the breaking of a storm inside her chest. The cowboy busied himself heating water, preparing what little food he had, beans, bread, and a kettle of tea. His movements were silent, efficient, but she could feel the weight of his presence in every corner of the small cabin. Finally, as the baby drifted into a shallow, exhausted sleep, she lifted her eyes to him. "Why'd you help us?" she asked softly. Her voice trembled with both gratitude and suspicion. He paused, staring into the fire for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, gravelly with memory, "Because once somebody needed help and I weren't there in time." Not again. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the distant rumble of thunder outside. She understood then that this man, this stranger, carried his own ghosts. And though neither of them trusted the other fully yet, fate had brought them together under the same roof, bound by the storm outside and the fragile child between them. That night, as the rain beat against the cabin walls, the young mother held her baby close and whispered thanks into the darkness. The cowboy sat silently across the room, hat tilted low, staring into the flames. Two souls, both scarred by life, had crossed paths by chance or maybe by something greater. And though neither knew what tomorrow would bring, one thing was certain. They were no longer alone. The buoyant morning after the storm broke with a pale golden light, spilling over the plains, washing the world clean of its violence. The grass sparkled with raindrops, the air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the sky stretched wide and blue, as if nothing cruel had happened the night before. Inside the small log cabin, the fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers. The young mother woke slowly, her head heavy with exhaustion, her arms curled protectively around her child. For the first time in days, the baby had slept soundly through the night, bundled warmly in blankets that smelled faintly of leather and smoke. She blinked in the dim light, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where she was, the cabin, the storm, the cowboy who had pulled her from the edge of despair. Across the room, the cowboy was already awake. He sat at the table, sharpening a knife with slow, steady strokes, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the quiet cabin. His hat was off, his dark hair hanging loose around his face, his eyes fixed on his work. He looked up briefly when she stirred, his expression unreadable, then returned to the blade. He had a way of being present without speaking, of filling the space with his steady, grounded energy. She sat up, clutching her child closer, unsure of what to say. He was the first to break the silence. "Coffee's on the stove," he said simply, his voice low, rough from years of little use. She glanced toward the iron pot steaming faintly, then back at him, hesitant. Slowly she rose, still holding her baby, and poured herself a cup. The warmth of it spread through her hands, and for a moment she closed her eyes, savoring the simple comfort. She hadn't known the taste of safety for so long that even coffee felt like a gift. He set the knife down, watching her carefully. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Elena," she whispered, "and this is Clara." She pressed a gentle kiss to her baby's head, her voice softening. "She's all I've got." The cowboy nodded once, his gaze lingering on the child. "Name's Caleb," he said finally. He didn't offer more, but the weight of his name carried a kind of quiet strength. Elena studied him, noting the scars etched into his face, the wear in his hands, the loneliness in his eyes. He was a man marked by battles, though she didn't yet know what kind. Days turned into a fragile rhythm, Elena and Clara stayed, at first only because she had nowhere else to go, but soon because the cabin offered a peace she hadn't known in years. She helped where she could, sweeping the floor, mending torn clothes, preparing meals with what little they had. Caleb rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, but he never once hinted that she was a burden. He repaired a crib for Clara out of old pine boards, rough but sturdy, and when Elena saw it, her heart broke with gratitude. She began to sense that beneath his hardened exterior lay a man who had been broken, but who still carried within him a quiet gentleness. Still, trust did not come easily. At night, when Clara was asleep, Elena often lay awake staring at the cabin ceiling, wondering when this fragile peace might shatter. She remembered the settlement that had cast her out, the voices that had condemned her, the fear of being hunted even out here in the wilderness. Sometimes she thought of leaving, afraid of bringing trouble to Caleb's doorstep. But each time she looked at Clara, safe and warm in the crib he had built, she knew she couldn't. For the first time in a long time, her child was thriving, and that mattered more than anything else. Caleb noticed her fear, though he never spoke of it directly. One evening, as he worked on mending a saddle by the fire, he said quietly, "Whoever threw you out, they don't get to come here. This place is mine. Nobody runs you off but me." His voice was steady, firm but beneath. It was something else, an unspoken promise that he had no intention of turning her away. Elena's eyes stung with tears, and though she couldn't find the words to thank him, she knew he understood. As the weeks passed, a bond began to grow between them, fragile but undeniable. Caleb would sometimes catch Clara's tiny fingers wrapped around his calloused hand, and though he tried to hide it, Elena saw the way his expression softened, the way old wounds seemed to heal for just a moment. Clara laughed for the first time in the cabin, a sound so pure it filled the room with light, and even Caleb smiled, a small, fleeting smile, but enough to show Elena that his heart was not as cold as he pretended. But peace never lasts forever. One afternoon, as Caleb was chopping wood outside, Elena heard the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. She froze, clutching Clara tightly, her heart hammering in her chest. Caleb heard it too. He dropped the axe and strode toward the ridge, his body tense. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, moving toward the cabin with the slow confidence of men who believed the land was theirs. Elena's breath caught. She recognized them, the same men who had stood among the crowd the night she was cast out, their eyes full of judgment and disdain. Caleb returned to the cabin, his jaw tight. "Stay inside," he ordered. His voice was calm but unyielding. Elena's hands shook as she pressed Clara to her chest, whispering prayers into the baby's hair. Through the window she watched as Caleb mounted his horse and rode out to meet the strangers. The confrontation unfolded just beyond the fence line, voices rising above the wind. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough to know what they wanted. They claimed Elena had brought shame to their town, that she had no right to shelter, no right to safety. They demanded Caleb hand her over, insisting she was nothing but trouble. Caleb sat tall in the saddle, his hand resting near his revolver, his face carved in stone. His reply was short, sharp, and final. "Ain't nobody taking her from here." The men didn't take kindly to his refusal. One spat in the dirt, another reached for his gun, but Caleb's hand moved faster, and the steel of his weapon glinted in the afternoon sun. His voice was low but dangerous. "You best turn back now. This land's mine, and I don't take kindly to trespassers." The men hesitated, reading the certainty in his stance, the cold fire in his eyes. Finally, with curses thrown into the wind, they turned their horses and rode back the way they had come. When Caleb returned to the cabin, Elena's eyes were wide with fear and gratitude. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. He simply nodded, hung his hat on the peg, and said, "They won't be back. Not while I'm here." That night, as the fire burned bright and Clara slept peacefully, Elena sat across from Caleb, her heart full of emotions she couldn't name. She realized that in this rugged, solitary cowboy she had found something she thought lost forever, a protector, a safe place, maybe even the possibility of love. Caleb, for his part, avoided her gaze, but deep inside he felt the walls around his heart beginning to crack. He had carried her and her baby home that stormy night out of a sense of duty, but now, as days turned into weeks, he knew it had become something far more. The storm that had cast her out had also carried her into his life. And as the wind howled outside the cabin that night, both of them began to understand that sometimes the harshest storms deliver the greatest gifts.